You know that moment when you discover your entire family has been living a lie? That was me, sitting in my corner office on the 52nd floor of a Seattle tech tower, staring at an email that wasn't meant for me, but somehow found its way into my inbox anyway. Morrison Family Reunion 2025, Rocky Mountain Resort, Colorado, RSVP by Friday. My hands went numb around my coffee mug. The Morrison Family Reunion. I hadn't been invited to one in, God, had it really been 12 years? I clicked open the attachment, even though every rational part of my brain was screaming not to. There they were, all laid out in a gorgeous PDF invitation with mountain graphics and gold lettering. My sister Madison and her corporate lawyer husband Ryan, their 3 teenagers, Connor, Blake, and Sophia, who must be 16 now. Aunt Rebecca from Denver with her new husband, Uncle Mike and his 4th wife. Even my disaster of a cousin Tyler, who'd been to rehab 3 times and once stole Mom's jewelry to buy drugs. But no Hallie. Not even a Hallie Morrison address unknown line. Just empty space where my name should have been. Like I was a ghost haunting the margins of my own bloodline. I sat there in my tailored Armani blazer, surrounded by awards for Tech Innovator of the Year and 40 under 40 business leaders, and felt exactly like I was 15 years old again, watching through the cafeteria window as the popular kids planned parties I'd never be invited to. But here's what nobody warns you about family erasure. It doesn't happen with dramatic confrontations or screaming matches. It's death by 1,000 tiny cuts, so subtle you don't even notice you're bleeding out until you're already ghost pale and hollow. It started the day I chose MIT over University of Colorado Boulder. I was 17, valedictorian, with full scholarships to both schools. Madison had stayed local, married her high school sweetheart right after graduation, bought a craftsman house 4 miles from our parents' place in Lakewood, the golden daughter who colored inside every line they drew for her. Meanwhile, I was the family rebel, the one who chose quantum computing over family barbecues, who spent her 20s building artificial intelligence systems instead of babies, who traded Colorado mountains for Boston winters and later Seattle rain. The real fracture came 12 years ago, when I was 31 and Dad had his accident. I was living in a converted warehouse loft in Boston's Innovation District, pulling 18-hour days as lead AI architect at Data Vault Technologies, a startup that would later be acquired by Microsoft for $2.8 billion. I was 3 weeks away from closing our Series C funding round when Mom's call shattered my world at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Your father's been in an accident. Black ice on Highway 70 coming back from his weekly poker game. His Silverado hit a patch of winter hell, flipped twice, and slammed into a stand of pine trees. The doctors at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital said it was a miracle he survived, but the traumatic brain injury stole the father I knew and left someone who looked like him but couldn't remember my middle name. I dropped everything, told my investors I needed emergency family leave, burned through my signing bonus paying for the best neurological specialists in Colorado, flew back every other weekend for 18 months straight. 18 months of sterile hospital corridors, physical therapy sessions where Dad had to relearn how to walk, and watching my brilliant father, the man who built a construction empire from nothing, struggle to remember how to button his shirt. Madison, who lived 30 minutes away in Wheat Ridge. She visited exactly 4 times. 4 times in 18 months. I just can't handle seeing Daddy like this, she'd whisper, dabbing at dry eyes with tissues. It's too heartbreaking. Hallie, you're so much stronger than I am. You always were. Stronger. That became their favorite word for me whenever they needed someone to carry the weight they couldn't lift. Mom was barely better. She'd sit in the family waiting area in her Sunday best, graciously accepting casseroles and sympathy from church ladies while I was in Dad's room, spoon-feeding him applesauce and reading chapters from his favorite Louis L'Amour westerns until my voice gave out. You came when the snow fell, Dad whispered to me one gray December afternoon, his words still slurred from the brain swelling. My steady girl always comes when the storms hit. I squeezed his hand and didn't correct him that it was actually spring. And the only storm was the one tearing our family apart. During one of those endless hospital vigils, I made the mistake of bringing up practical concerns. Dad's construction company, Morrison and Sons, though I was the only son he'd ever really had, was hemorrhaging cash without his leadership. The family cabin up in Breckenridge, our sacred summer sanctuary for 4 generations, needed critical roof repairs that nobody was addressing. The medical bills were astronomical, even with insurance. What's the financial plan? I asked Mom during one of our cafeteria conversations. For the business, the cabin, Dad's ongoing care? Her face pinched tight, like I'd asked her to perform brain surgery. Madison and I have been handling the important decisions, she said, stirring her coffee with sharp, angry strokes. You don't need to worry about Colorado business anymore, honey. You've got your own big city life to manage. Your own big city life. Like I hadn't just spent $127,000 of my own money on Dad's care and burned every bridge at work to be here when it mattered. But I didn't push. I was trained to be the good daughter, the competent one, the fixer who showed up and shut up and handled whatever crisis everyone else was too delicate to face. Dad survived, but he was fundamentally changed. The sharp, charismatic man who taught me to read blueprints and negotiate construction contracts became someone who needed help, remembering which shoes went on which feet. And somehow, in the careful choreography of reorganizing our family around his limitations, I became expendable. The exclusion started microscopically. Family group texts that I wasn't added to. Holiday plans discussed and finalized before anyone bothered mentioning them to me. Facebook photos of gatherings I didn't know were happening, tagged with captions like, "So grateful for family time," while I sat in my Boston loft wondering why my phone had gone silent. Madison was a virtuoso at this particular cruelty. She'd post Instagram stories of spontaneous Sunday dinners, featuring perfectly plated meals and artfully casual family candids. Mom would comment with strings of heart emojis and, "My beautiful babies," while I realized I hadn't been invited to a family meal in 6 months. When I tried to stay connected, my efforts disappeared into the void. Birthday gifts for my nephews and niece that generated no thank you calls. Christmas presents that were never acknowledged. Messages in the family chat that floated unread while everyone else's got immediate responses and emoji reactions. The breaking point came 4 years ago, during what should have been our traditional Thanksgiving at the Breckenridge cabin. I'd flown back from Seattle. I'd moved there 2 years earlier to become CTO at Neuralink Dynamics, a machine learning company that was revolutionizing predictive analytics. I rented a car at Den, drove the familiar mountain highway, pulled into the cabin's gravel driveway at sunset, ready to help with dinner prep like I had every year since childhood. But the cabin was dark, empty. The electronic lock had been changed. I called Madison from the front porch where I'd learned to read, where Dad had taught me to identify constellations, where 4 generations of Morrison women had snapped green beans and shared secrets. "Oh," Madison's voice was bright with performed surprise. "We moved Thanksgiving to Mom's new condo this year. Didn't anyone tell you? I could have sworn someone sent you the details." My phone showed 0 missed calls, 0 unread messages, 0 notifications. "What time should I head over?" I asked, still trying to salvage something from the wreckage. "Well, we're actually finishing up dessert," she said, and I could hear Connor's teenage laughter in the background. My nephew, who I'd taught to skip rocks when he was 7. "But maybe next year we'll coordinate better. You know how crazy the holidays get." I sat in that rental Jeep for 2 hours, staring at the dark cabin windows, listening to silence that used to be filled with our voices. The place where I'd scattered Grandpa's ashes, the place where Dad had taught me that family meant showing up, especially when it was hard. Finally, I drove back to Denver, changed my red-eye flight to leave immediately, and flew back to Seattle without saying goodbye to a single family member. That was the last time I tried to force my way back into a family that had already voted me out. For the next 4 years, I threw myself into work with the intensity of someone trying to outrun grief. I climbed from CTO to Chief Innovation Officer at Neuralink, then founded my own company, Axiom Intelligence, specializing in AI systems for healthcare diagnostics. By 38, I was worth $47 million on paper. I bought a penthouse in Belltown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. I dated Dr. Marcus Chen, a brilliant pediatric cardiologist who was too busy saving children's lives to ask uncomfortable questions about why I never mentioned my family. I convinced myself I'd built something better than what I'd lost. That success was the best revenge. That I didn't need people who'd proven I was disposable. But you can't algorithm your way out of the hollow space where a family used to live. Then my neighbor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a corporate attorney who'd helped me structure Axiom's partnership agreements, sent me a text that detonated my carefully constructed new life. "Isn't this your family's place?" she wrote, attaching a screenshot of a luxury real estate listing. Morrison Mountain Retreat, Breckenridge, Colorado, $4.8 million. Motivated seller, priced for quick sale. I stared at that phone screen for 15 minutes, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Our cabin. The 1920s log structure that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. The place where Dad taught me to fly fish in the creek behind the property. The place where Mom showed me how to make her legendary huckleberry pancakes. The place where I'd carved my initials next to 4 generations of Morrison names on the big oak beam in the great room. For sale. Without a single word to me. My hands were trembling as I scrolled through the professional photographs. The same stone fireplace where we'd roasted marshmallows during summer thunderstorms. The same wraparound porch where Dad and I had watched meteor showers every August. The same kitchen window where Mom used to stand washing dishes and humming old country songs. But something was wrong with the listing details. The ownership showed Morrison Family Properties, LLC, a business entity I'd never heard of. The listing agent was some Denver luxury specialist I didn't recognize, and according to the timeline, the property had been actively marketed for 3 months. 3 months they'd been planning to sell my childhood, and nobody thought I deserved to know. I called Mom for the first time in 3 years. "Hallie?" Her voice carried surprise mixed with something that might have been guilt. Well, this is unexpected. How are you doing, sweetheart? I'm looking at a real estate listing for the cabin. Mom. Want to explain why I'm finding out about this from Zillow? Silence stretched between us like a canyon. Then, oh, honey, we didn't want to bother you with family business. You're so successful and busy with your company up there in Seattle. Bother me. It's our cabin. 4 generations of our family's cabin. Hallie, be realistic. Her voice took on that patient tone she used when she thought I was being dramatic. None of us really use it anymore. The property taxes are outrageous. The maintenance costs are brutal. And Madison says we're sitting on a fortune just letting it collect dust. It makes perfect financial sense, Madison says. Of course it did. And you didn't think I might have an opinion about selling our family legacy? Another pause. Sweetheart, you haven't been to the cabin in years. You made it pretty clear that your priorities are in the tech world now. She wasn't wrong, but only because they'd literally locked me out, physically and emotionally. Who else knows about this decision? Well, everyone, naturally. We had a family meeting about it over Christmas. Everyone agreed it was the smart move. Everyone, the whole family, making decisions about my inheritance while I was spending Christmas alone in my penthouse, convincing myself I preferred solitude to their conditional love. After I hung up, I poured 3 fingers of 18-year-old Macallan and stood on my balcony, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in those city lights were thousands of people who knew me as Hallie Morrison, the tech innovator who'd revolutionized medical AI. But to my own blood, I was less than nothing. I was actively erased. That's when I remembered something Dad had told me years before his accident, back when his mind was sharp and his words carried weight. I was maybe 16, and Madison had thrown one of her theatrical meltdowns about some perceived slight, probably not getting to choose the movie for family night. Dad had pulled me aside on the cabin's deck, his arm around my shoulders as we watched sunset turn the Rockies gold. Hallie, you're the one who thinks in decades, not moments, he'd said. Madison sees what's right in front of her, but you see the long game. You understand that some things are worth more than their price tag. Don't ever let anyone convince you to think small. Sitting there in my penthouse, those words hit me like revelation. I opened my laptop and started digging. Morrison Family Properties, LLC, established 14 months ago, right after Dad finally succumbed to complications from his brain injury. But here's what Madison didn't know about her brilliant older sister. I'd spent 15 years navigating complex corporate structures, hostile takeovers, and family trusts for tech companies. I knew exactly how to forensically examine business entities and find their weak spots. I called in favors from Harvard Law classmates who specialized in estate planning. I hired Colorado's top investigative accountant. I spent 4 days straight unraveling the legal web Madison had spun around Dad's assets. What I discovered was stunning. Dad's original will, executed 7 years before his accident when his mind was laser sharp, contained a provision that Madison had either overlooked or hoped I'd never find. If the primary beneficiaries ever allowed his properties to fall into material neglect, financial delinquency, or breach of family stewardship duties, then ownership would automatically transfer to what the document called the designated caretaker heir. That was me, the daughter who'd shown up when storms hit, But the real revelation was in the property records. The cabin's taxes hadn't been paid in 16 months. They were in serious delinquency. The insurance had lapsed 8 months ago. There were outstanding code violations for structural repairs that nobody had addressed. The place had been broken into twice by local teenagers, with police reports filed but no follow-up action taken. Madison and Mom had been so focused on cashing out that they'd completely failed to maintain the property. In their eagerness to cut me out of the equation, they'd triggered the exact legal conditions that would transfer complete ownership to me. The irony was perfect. On a crisp Friday morning in October, exactly 12 years after Dad's accident, I drove a leased Tesla Model S up the familiar mountain highway toward Breckenridge. My corporate attorney sat in the passenger seat with a briefcase full of legal documents. Behind us, a moving truck carried furniture I'd ordered from Denver's finest home stores. The cabin looked heartbreakingly neglected. The forest green shutters were weather-stained and hanging crooked. Several porch boards were rotted through. Someone had spray-painted Seniors 2024 in silver across the back wall. But it was still home. Still mine, even though they'd tried to auction off my birthright. I used the emergency key Dad had hidden inside the carved wooden bear on the porch, a secret only he and I had shared. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered, except covered in dust and the musty smell of abandonment. The family photos on the stone mantel told the story of my systematic erasure, all of us together when I was young. Progressively fewer images including me, until the most recent photos showed only Madison's nuclear family smiling at the camera. But in Dad's old office, tucked behind his collection of popular mechanics magazines, I found the manila envelope that validated everything. It was addressed to me in Dad's careful architect's handwriting, sealed with red wax the way he used to seal our treasure hunt clues when I was little. My dearest Hallie, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've had to fight for what should have always been yours without question. I'm sorry it came to this, but I know your mother and sister better than they know themselves. They see dollar signs where you see memories. They hear expensive where you hear priceless. You were always the one who understood what this place really represents, not just a vacation home or a real estate investment, but the physical embodiment of our family's story. The continuity that connects great-grandfather's hands building these walls to your hands, reading this letter. This cabin needs someone who sees it with their soul, not their spreadsheet. Take care of our place. My steady girl. Fill it with laughter again. Make it a home where the next generation of Morrisons can learn what family really means. P.S. Check behind the loose stone in the fireplace. Your great-grandfather was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Behind that stone was another envelope containing a deed to 60 acres of pristine wilderness adjoining the cabin property, land that great-grandfather had quietly purchased during the Depression and that nobody else knew existed. 60 acres that would make the combined property worth closer to $12 million, not the $4.8 million Madison was planning to accept. I sat on the dusty hardwood floor and laughed until tears streaked my face. 4 generations of Morrison men had been playing the long game, each one setting up safeguards to protect what mattered most. Dad had seen Madison's greed coming from miles away and had made sure the daughter who showed up would inherit not just a cabin, but a legacy. The legal battle took 6 months and probably cost Madison more than she would have netted from the sale. She hired Holbrook and Associates, Denver's most ruthless estate litigation firm, and deployed every weapon in their arsenal. They claimed Dad wasn't mentally competent when he wrote the will. They argued I'd manipulated him during his recovery. They even suggested I'd forged the documents. But I had something more powerful than expensive lawyers. I had documentation. 15 years of medical records proving Dad's mental acuity when he established the original trust. Bank records showing I'd contributed over $200,000 to his medical care when nobody else would. Property maintenance receipts proving my consistent care for the cabin before they locked me out. Expert testimony from Dr. Williams, Dad's neurologist, confirming his cognitive clarity when he updated his estate planning. The trial took place in Summit County District Court on a snowy Tuesday in February. I wore a navy blue suit that cost more than most people's cars, and carried myself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built a tech empire from nothing. Madison arrived with her legal team looking like she was attending a charity gala, all designer, everything, and performative grief. Judge Patricia Henley was a woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of family dysfunction. She listened to Madison's attorneys paint me as a manipulative daughter exploiting a brain-injured father. Then she listened to my legal team present a mountain of evidence showing Madison's negligence and my unwavering devotion to both Dad and his property. The turning point came when they played a video deposition Dad had recorded 2 years before his death, when his mind had cleared enough for him to understand his mortality. "I want Hallie to have the cabin and the land," he said clearly, looking directly into the camera. "Madison thinks in quarterly profits, but Hallie thinks in generations. She's the only one who understood that some things can't be measured in dollars. She's the caretaker. She always was." Madison's face went ashen. Mom started crying real tears for the first time I could remember. But I felt only profound peace. Judge Henley removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly before delivering her verdict. "This court finds that the decedent's testamentary intentions were unambiguous and legally sound," she said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute fairness. "The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates a pattern of stewardship by the plaintiff and neglect by the defendants. The automatic transfer provision in the Morrison Trust is both valid and appropriately triggered. Ms. Hallie Morrison is hereby recognized as the sole owner of the cabin property and all adjoining lands." The gavel came down like thunder. Madison's legal team immediately filed appeals that would ultimately fail. Mom left the courthouse without making eye contact, but I walked out into that February snowfall feeling something I hadn't experienced in over a decade. I belonged somewhere again. The cabin was mine. All 63 acres were mine. But more importantly, I had reclaimed something more valuable than real estate, my place in the story of who the Morrisons really were. The first thing I did after winning the cabin wasn't celebrate. It was sit in my car outside the courthouse for 20 minutes. Watching Madison storm across the snowy parking lot in her designer heels, her legal team trailing behind her like expensive shadows. She didn't look back. Not once. That told me everything I needed to know about who she really was underneath all that perfect performance. When the mask slipped, there was nothing but cold calculation where her heart should have been. I drove straight to the cabin that afternoon, my hands steady on the Tesla's wheel for the first time in months. The February sun was already setting behind the peaks, painting the snow gold and pink in that way that only happens in the Rockies. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, my gravel driveway now, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child. I was home. Really, truly home. The renovation took 4 months. I hired the best restoration team in Colorado, the same company that had worked on the governor's historic mansion. We stripped away years of neglect, replaced every rotted board, restored the original log walls to their honey-colored glory. I had the stone fireplace professionally cleaned, revealing carved initials I'd forgotten existed, HM plus Dad 1997, scratched into the hearthstone during a summer when I was still young enough to think love lasted forever. But I didn't just restore the cabin, I transformed it. The old bunk room where Madison and I used to fight over who got the window bed became my new home office, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the creek and enough tech infrastructure to run Axiom intelligence from anywhere in the world. The musty basement became a wine cellar stocked with bottles I'd only dreamed of affording in my 20s. The tiny kitchen where Mom used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings expanded into a gourmet space where I could finally learn to cook the comfort foods I'd been craving for years. Every decision was mine. Every paint color, every piece of furniture, every light fixture. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that belonged to me completely, something nobody could vote me out of or lock me away from. The best part was the silence. No family group chats buzzing with plans that didn't include me. No social media posts reminding me of my absence. No performance anxiety about whether I was being the right kind of daughter, sister, niece. Just the sound of wind through pine trees and my own breathing. I started working from the cabin 3 days a week, commuting between my Seattle penthouse and my Colorado sanctuary. My team at Axiom adapted perfectly. Turns out running a tech company is a lot easier when you're not carrying the emotional weight of family rejection. My productivity skyrocketed. Our client base doubled. I felt sharp and focused in a way I hadn't since before Dad's accident. But the real transformation happened on a Thursday in June, exactly 6 months after the trial. I was on the deck, laptop open, video conferencing with a potential client in Singapore when a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. My stomach dropped when I recognized the driver. Mom. She sat in her car for 5 full minutes before getting out. I could see her through my office window, gripping the steering wheel, probably rehearsing whatever speech she'd prepared. Finally. She emerged wearing a floral sundress I remembered from family photos. Her silver hair styled the way she'd worn it since the 80s. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, fragile in a way that made my chest tight with emotions I wasn't ready to examine. I met her on the front porch, the same porch where I'd been locked out 4 years earlier. "The place looks beautiful, honey," she said, her voice careful and formal. You've really made it special. Thank you." I kept my voice neutral, professional, the same tone I used with difficult clients. We stood there for a moment, 2 women who used to braid each other's hair, now strangers separated by years of accumulated silence. "I was wrong," Mom said finally, the words coming out in a rush like she'd been holding her breath. "About you. About what you meant to this family. About what you were trying to do when your father was sick." I didn't respond. I'd learned the hard way that family apologies often came with invisible strings attached. "Madison told me about the medical bills," she continued. $200,000 of your own money. I never knew. She never told me how much you sacrificed to take care of him." Madison knew? She handled the estate paperwork after he died. Found all the bank transfers, the receipts. Mom's voice cracked. You paid for everything. The specialists, the private nursing, the experimental treatments. I thought you were just doing your duty. I didn't realize you were bankrupting yourself to save him. The word bankrupting wasn't accurate. I'd made the money back within 2 years, but the principle stung. They'd watched me pour everything into Dad's care and assumed it was easy for me, that my money somehow mattered less because I'd earned it in a different state. Why didn't you ask? I said. Why didn't anyone ever just ask what it was costing me? Mom's eyes filled with tears, real ones this time. Because we were scared. Your father was dying. You were this successful tech executive living this glamorous life in Boston and Seattle. We assumed you had everything figured out. Madison said you probably wrote off the medical expenses as business deductions anyway. Madison said. Always, Madison said. And you believed her instead of talking to me directly. I was drowning. Hallie. The words came out as a whisper. Your father was disappearing piece by piece. Madison was handling everything because I couldn't. And you seemed so competent and distant, and I was too ashamed to admit I needed help. Too proud to admit I didn't understand anything about estates or trusts or tax implications. For the first time since she'd arrived, I really looked at my mother, saw the deep lines around her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly, the careful way she held herself like she was afraid of breaking. She'd aged a decade in the 4 years since I'd seen her. Madison made some mistakes, Mom continued, with the cabin, with the business, with how she talked about you. She was overwhelmed too, trying to manage everything after Dad died. But that's not an excuse for how we treated you. Some mistakes. That was one way to put it. She tried to sell my inheritance without telling me. Mom. She had my locks changed. She erased me from family photos on Facebook. I know. Mom's voice was barely audible. I know. And I should have stopped it. I should have called you. Should have included you. Should have... She trailed off, staring at the mountains. I was a coward. I let Madison handle the hard conversations because I was too broken to fight for what was right. I wanted to stay angry. Anger was clean, simple, protective. But looking at this fragile woman who'd given me life and then spent decades taking it back in tiny increments, I felt something more complicated than rage. I felt sorry for her. Come inside, I said. The cabin tour took an hour. Mom moved through the renovated rooms like she was visiting a museum, touching surfaces reverently, stopping to examine photo displays I'd created celebrating our family's history, including pictures of her and Dad from their early years, when they still looked at each other like the world held infinite possibilities. You kept the good memories, she said, studying a framed photo of all of us from my high school graduation. Even after everything. I kept the true memories, I corrected. The ones that mattered before everything got complicated. We ended up in the kitchen, where I made coffee using Dad's old percolator that I'd rescued from storage. Mom sat at the breakfast bar, running her fingers over the granite countertop, probably calculating what it had cost. I want to tell you something, she said as I handed her a mug. About the night your father died. I tensed. I'd been in Seattle when it happened, closing a major deal with a healthcare consortium. Madison had called me after the funeral arrangements were already made. He was having one of his good days, Mom continued. You know how he'd get sometimes, when the fog would lift and he'd be almost himself again? He asked me to get his legal papers from the safe, said he wanted to make sure everything was in order for his girls. His girls, plural. He spent 2 hours going through his will, his trust documents, the property deeds. He was so lucid, so focused, like the old days when he was planning a construction project. She paused, staring into her coffee. Then he looked at me and said, "Promise me Hallie gets the cabin. Promise me you won't let Madison's practical nature override what's right. Hallie understands what this place means." My throat closed up. What did you say? I promised him. I held his hand and promised. Tears were streaming down Mom's face now. And then I broke that promise the minute it became inconvenient. I let Madison convince me that selling was smarter, that you wouldn't care, that you'd probably prefer the cash anyway. I set my coffee down with shaking hands. He knew, Mom whispered. Even with his injured brain, he knew exactly who his daughters were and what they'd do. He built in protections because he knew I'd fail him. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the creek babble outside the kitchen windows. Finally, Mom spoke again. I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back 12 years of birthdays and holidays and family dinners. I can't erase the things Madison said about you, or the way we made you feel disposable. She looked up at me with eyes that were exactly like my own. But I can tell you the truth now. You were never the problem, Zissa Hallie. You were the solution we were too broken to recognize. That night, after Mom drove back to Denver with promises to call every week, I sat on the deck with a glass of wine and watched the stars emerge over the peaks. For the first time in years, I felt something approaching peace. Not because Mom had apologized, though that mattered. Not because she had validated Dad's final wishes, though that helped heal something deep inside me. Because I finally understood that I'd never been fighting for their approval. I'd been fighting for my right to exist in my own story. And I'd won. The months that followed were the happiest of my adult life. I spent more time at the cabin, less time chasing achievements. I learned to fly fish in Dad's favorite creek spots. I planted a garden behind the cabin, growing herbs and vegetables I actually had time to cook. I hired a local contractor to build a workshop where I could try woodworking, remembering how Dad used to let me help with small projects when I was little. I even started dating again, not Dr. Marcus, who had been focused on his career anyway, but David Reeves, a park ranger I met at the Breckenridge Farmers Market. He was nothing like the ambitious tech executives and finance guys I usually attracted. He loved hiking and campfires and could identify every bird call in the Rockies. He made me laugh. Most importantly, he never once asked me to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. Madison never apologized directly, but about a year after the trial, she started liking my Instagram posts, pictures of the renovated cabin, shots of me hiking with David, photos of dinners I'd cooked, small digital olive branches acknowledging my existence without admitting wrongdoing. I liked her posts back, because forgiveness isn't always about dramatic reconciliation scenes. Sometimes it's about choosing not to carry the weight of someone else's limitations. The cabin became exactly what Dad had envisioned, a place where family could mean something deeper than biology. I hosted Axiom retreats there, watching brilliant minds collaborate on breakthrough technologies while surrounded by Morrison craftsmanship. I invited Mom for holidays, not the performative gatherings of my childhood, but quiet celebrations where we could talk honestly about who we'd been and who we were becoming. Even Madison came eventually, bringing her teenagers for a long weekend where they learned to fish and hike and appreciate something beyond their suburban bubble. Connor, now 16 and excited about his junior year, told me I was his favorite aunt, not because I'd fought for my inheritance, but because I'd shown him what it looked like to stand up for yourself with dignity. The cabin taught me something I'd never learned in all my years of tech success: that belonging isn't something other people give you. It's something you create for yourself, one choice at a time. Sitting here now, writing the story on the deck where Dad once taught me to read the stars, I can honestly say I'm grateful for every rejection, every exclusion, every moment when my family chose not to see me. Because in fighting for my place in their story, I discovered I had the power to write my own,